Hello, everybody. This is Ashley with the Couch YouTube channel, and I am coming on here live with a prosecutor. So, this is going to be a part of our hashtag George Floyd for the Love of Justice um, mini series that I have going on in conjunction with some of the other series that I'm doing. And so, I'd like to introduce our guest today. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ashley Hall. I'm an assistant district attorney in Tennessee, and I am excited to be here today.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you. So what really sparked this whole desire to do the For the Love of Justice like mini series on my YouTube channel was because I felt like there's so much information, specifically misinformation, about the brutal killings of unarmed Black men and women, and what laws and regulations and things that we should keep in mind in order to not be another hashtag, or to not perpetuate the kind of misinformation that could escalate a situation. The racial tensions are high. People are afraid. There's a lot going on right now. And so we're really just going to go over some questions and also give the audience a chance to type in some questions into the comment section, so that way we can have the conversation about the recent events and what to do in order to protect yourself in the event that you find yourself in a situation that's pretty aggressive and you're dealing with a law enforcement officer. So go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I'm sorry. I was just listening.
It's okay. So our first question, I know that you introduced yourself. Give us a little bit of background information about you, like what legal roles you've worked in and what type of work you currently do.
So I currently work in criminal law. I have worked in the law since I joined the Army right after high school in 2008. So I've been in the legal field for over 10 years. I did criminal law in the military, and I worked for the prosecution side there. And then after doing some civil law as a paralegal, I went to law school, and out of law school, I clerked for a criminal court judge here in Tennessee, and then moved over to the district attorney's office. So overall, I've spent over 10 years in criminal law specifically, and also kind of dabbled in a few other things.
Oh, awesome. Yes. So she's very well versed, which is why I'm so excited to have her on today, because she's going to share with us some awesome insights about the justice system and how we can make this thing work in our favor as much as possible. So, what are your thoughts on the protest and the killing of unarmed Black people?
So, like I would hope everyone's opinion would be, I think that it's tragic. And not only is it tragic, it's devastating for entire communities. It's kind of hard to put into words exactly how you feel about each individual killing, because it is proof over and over and over again that we need to do better. We need to change things. We need to do things differently in order to have law enforcement and policing kind of reflect the values of each community. So to just say that it's tragic and it's devastating, I don't think says enough. But there also aren't really words that are really can verbalize how we all feel about what's going on. It really is just tragic and a huge wake-up call that change is absolutely necessary.
Yes, absolutely. And I think sometimes there's a sentiment, and even though I feel like we are crushing every stereotype when it comes to the thought that Black and white people aren't really on the same sides in this. I think that there's an unfortunate amount of rhetoric that would state that there aren't Black and white people who are on the same side, who were kind of, having the same goals of obliterating racially motivated injustices, or just racism in general and the horrific impact that it has on the everyday lives of Black people in America and all over. Because I think we like to think that it's only in one like centralized location, but unfortunately, racism is something that is everywhere. And so I do think that this is, seeing the protesters in, I'm going to say a myriad of different nationalities and backgrounds. I think that that's done a lot to prove that together we're a lot more powerful of an ally against racism.
Yeah.
And so that makes a difference.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that we have spent a long time in this country feeling divided. And I think that in a lot of ways, the media perpetuates that negatively. Like we're sitting here today, we're on the same side of things need to be different, things need to change, and this is how it should change. We can all agree on that. And so I think it's important that we kind of pick out the situations where we know we agree. We're not looking at this entire thing as a divided situation. It's not white versus Black or people of color versus white people. It's not, viewing it that way, I think, is absolutely detrimental to change. So whenever we start looking at it like, okay, now we're having this conversation because we recognize that there is a problem and there's a divide. And so now we have to take that and say, okay, the media is going to continue to perpetuate a divide because that's what gets people tuned in. So now what can we do and what actions can we take together, knowing that we may not be as divided on these issues as the media wants us to think? And there's so much that goes into all of that. There's so much that goes into affecting change that it's hard to just say this one thing has to be different and everything will be different. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
But I think if the people that make decisions, the people that implement the changes can see and are aware that we really are on the same side of this. We want there to be an end to systemic racism. We want there to be an end to injustice. And we, I think, to get there, have to get people to understand that this is how it's been, that it's not an over exaggeration. It's not a lie. Racism has a very strong foundation in America. So now I think with everything that's happened recently, it's been a great opportunity to say, well, these are the ways that we can come together. And having so many people recognize the past, recognize the injustice, and recognize the actual issue for what it is and not looking at it through a lens of color, I think that helps a lot. But that also has its own downside, so to speak, which is you can't forge ahead saying, I don't recognize color if you haven't accepted the foundation of racism to begin with. And so to get to criminal justice type changes, I think once you have people accepting that racism is a thing and that these are occurrences that happen as a result of that. And it may not be someone saying I'm racist or a law enforcement officer being racist, but you do have those kind of ingrained ideals and ideas that maybe you should take a look at. And all of that filters in and is a part of the change that has to happen.
Absolutely. And really just kind of diving into some of the questions that I think are on the forefront of a lot of people's minds, especially people who live in different states, different places that have policies that do target disproportionately Black people and people of color in general. What are in the wake of the recent events, coupled by policies like, stop and frisk, how can Black people legally protect themselves from unlawful arrest or harassment by the police?
So I think that it's important to know that you have rights. You have rights in terms of when you are initially approached by police, and depending on what's alleged to have happened or why you're speaking to police, it's how you are going to interpret that interaction is going to vary. I think that it is most effective to remain calm and ask what's going on. And I think that it's easy to say, stop and ask, why am I being pulled over? Why am I being detained? But I think that it's an important step in standing up for yourself against unlawfully being detained or arrested. So as far as stop and frisk laws, I think that they have a place with the idea of trying to protect the community and trying to protect the law enforcement officers that are there. However, like with most things, we've gone too far. We have used these things as a mechanism to kind of perpetuate the injustice that's already going on. And when you put law enforcement officers in communities of color, communities where there's a lot of crime or a lot of violence, of course people are going to look suspicious. Of course you're going to think that something's going on, or that the people in the community are going to see law enforcement and run the other way, whether you're doing something wrong or not doing something wrong. So keeping that in mind whenever you are out in the community, knowing that you can come into contact with law enforcement, I think it's important to just stay calm and to ask questions. I think it's far more difficult just said, or far more difficult to do than just being said. So I think, know your rights. Why did they stop you? What were you doing that made them stop you? And if they can't say that, oh, I stopped you because of this reason or that reason that has a legal basis, then at that point you can ask if you're detained. And if you're not detained, then you can walk away. And I think that it becomes very touchy and I think very difficult to say that you could just walk away, because you can't. Legally you can, but you're running a huge risk when you do it. And so this is where I think that big changes need to come in. And that is like with stop and frisk laws. You need to change those to say, well, what are we gaining from doing this? And kind of look at it a little bit differently. As it's difficult to say what exactly can get you out of an interaction alive. I think that normally the goal in any interaction, anytime someone's pulled over, someone's stopped by police, the times that police are called to a home, there is always a risk of violence there. And that is why I think training is the number one thing that's going to protect people and actually save lives. You can ask if you're being detained. You can try to leave the interaction. But the bottom line is everyone is trying to leave this interaction safely and alive. And you have to get there by training law enforcement how to handle each situation and de-escalate violence or potential violence. So if you are pulled over and you have someone with their hands that are up that are saying, hey, I'm just sleeping here, or hey, I was speeding, but here's my license and registration, or something like that, you have to train law enforcement to recognize when they're actually in danger and when they're not. When someone's like this, there's no real danger there. So I think that whenever it comes down to just the safety of a situation, you listen, you do what they ask you to do, but at the end of the day, they are responsible for what's going on, and they need to be trained and then held accountable for what's going on. If I rambled a lot, I'm very sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly think that a lot of the frustration with hearing better training is because it's so, you know, most people would say intuitive, that if somebody has their hands up, then, and right, what's going on?
That they need to be trained and then held accountable for what's going on. If I rambled a lot, I'm very sorry.
Nope, it's completely fine. Most people would say intuitive. That if somebody has their hands up, then I'm echoing here. Yeah, I completely agree with, I think, the thought of frustration that here we are again, every time there's a new hashtag, here we are again with police officers who have training saying that they fear for their lives, and the average person doesn't get training in how to deal with the police other than maybe the conversations that they might have with their parents. And the reality is a lot of us might be looking at some of the footage and thinking, well, this is exactly what I would have done in some of the situations, not all of them, and kind of be out of a loss for words on exactly what to do next. So just kind of speaking on, because you mentioned legal rights earlier, what are my legal rights when I'm approached by a police officer?
You have a right to know why they stopped you. So, for example, if you are speeding down the road and you're not doing anything else, you're just speeding down the road. So you get the police come up behind you, they come up to the window, and they're like, generally they'll ask you if you know why they stopped you or something like that. And just say no. Just say you don't know, that you need them to tell you why they're stopping you. And at that point, if they cannot tell you why they're stopping you, I think that that's where it gets a little bit difficult to say, these are your rights and this is what you can do, because you have a right to know why they're stopping you. And if they're not going to tell you at that point, there's really not much that you could say or do. I would say maybe get someone on the phone with you whenever you notice that you're getting pulled over, or kind of have maybe like record the interaction or something like that to keep people honest about what's going on. I think one of the best things that we have now in law enforcement is body cams. As a prosecutor, that has helped me tremendously in understanding the dynamic and the interactions. But that's a later down the road kind of fix for a situation. So it all ends up going back to, you know, that you have the right to know why you were stopped and why you were pulled over, why you're interacting with the police. If they have a valid reason for the interaction, like you're speeding, they can stop you and detain you for the speeding ticket. So they'll get your license, they'll get your registration, and go back to the car and run for warrants and things like that. That should not take any longer than is necessary to run those things, to call it in, and to issue the citation. So you run into other problems where maybe more officers come on scene and things like that. And it really ratchets up the intensity of the situation when maybe that's not necessary. So it's hard to say. Your right is to know why you're being detained and what you're doing. You have the right to walk away if you are not being lawfully detained by law enforcement. But what happens when law enforcement isn't holding up their end of the bargain on doing what they need to do and letting you go, or entering a situation and maybe addressing it and moving on? There's really no good answer for that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was saying, could you repeat that last part? The audio is going out a little bit.
Oh no. Let me see. Now I gotta think about what I said.
What if they don't feel that they're part of the deal as the police officers if they're unlawfully trying to detain you?
There's really no good answer about how to handle that situation. It's hard to say, well, let that happen and take care of it on the back end. But also, like, it's frustrating for everyone else that we know and it's evident that maybe better training is needed. So to kind of give a little bit of a foundation for like, what is police training? What do we mean by better training? We don't just mean to say, oh, they need to be trained better, and that's the end. You have to look at, well, what kind of training do they actually go into? And where can we see that there's something that we can do better, change about that? And that's where I think you get the real difference. The difference that you can see and that people feel safer comes from knowing that law enforcement is trained in a way to not exercise violence when that's just not necessary, or to overreact in volatile situations. I think one of the big things that people have been talking about lately is that law enforcement responds first. Okay. So if law enforcement is responding first to a call from someone that there's a lady out on the sidewalk screaming and yelling at a fence, kicking things over, this, that, or the other, law enforcement is going to be the first one that makes contact with her. So what do they do now? She is aggressive. She's throwing things around and acting crazy, but why? And law enforcement doesn't generally, they don't have the training and they don't have the skills to say, oh, this is a mental health crisis, so now we need to take steps to deal with this as a mental health crisis. They're trained to deal with the issue that they see, and what they see is she's kicking over plants and screaming at a wall. So their solution is that they have to make an arrest. And if you think about it, what else are they there to do? They're not there to treat mental health issues. And so I think that all of this taken together shows that they need more. Law enforcement has become a job that needs training in multiple disciplines across the board. And with what comes with multidisciplinary training is that you have to vet the people that you are letting into law enforcement better. So it's a big issue, and fixing it is going to take so much time, but it takes everyone recognizing that, well, why can't we say exactly what someone of color can do to leave a police interaction alive? There should be a way, like, why is that a question? And now that it is a question, why is it that we can't verbalize exactly how this interaction goes and how exactly to stay safe? So I think that that's where you get to a major intersection of better people, better training, and spending time in communities that you're working in is so important. And I, again, just went off on my own thing.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, even though this is new for other demographics, This is, you know, this might be news to some demographics, but for Black and Brown people, this has been a thing since forever. And so a lot of the conversation surrounding it is, I think, in some circles, just now starting to be a multicultural conversation, at least on news platforms and in newspapers, you know, to the extent that it's been at least in our favor, you know, to a certain extent. And even then, we see that there's still news outlets and media platforms that are really divided about how they feel about what's going on. And so we may not have always had the same amount of advocacy outside of our nationality and our cultural groups, but it's always been an issue. So I appreciate you really pointing out the issue that it's hard to say, it's easy to say what our rights are across the board, what they should be, but it's really difficult to say what should be done in an interaction with a police officer, not because the law isn't in our favor, but really because at the end of the day, if a police officer does have some bias or prejudice against people of color, Black people specifically, then the reality is you could be doing all the right things and still receive all the wrong results. And so I
Yeah.
think that that also fuels, not even I think, I'm sure that that fuels the frustration in a lot of homes. So what recommendations or procedures would you advise for those who are stopped by the police to prevent them from being detained unnecessarily? You might make it out of that situation maybe without a bullet, but in a lot of cases, maybe you might be detained unlawfully. So how do you make it out of that situation?
I think one of the major things is to know exactly what your rights are in your state. So the laws vary depending on what state you're in about what rights each individual person has. You do have the right to know why you're being stopped. You have the right to know what you're suspected of. You have a right to not be physically harmed during that interaction. Basically, it comes down to, in that first 20 seconds, they can either tell you why they're stopping you or they can't. And if it's an interaction where they're just coming up to you and asking you questions, that's what we call a consensual interaction. And you don't have to stay and answer those questions. I think that where it gets difficult to say what to do is when it comes to what happens after you start to walk away. And that is the question that we have no real good answer to. But just knowing that if they can't tell you a reason that they stopped you, if they can't articulate that, then you can leave that interaction. If you ask if you're being detained and they tell you that you're not being detained, you can leave that interaction. But anytime you deal with law enforcement, it's intense. It is scary. And I can only imagine that that is amplified if you are a person of color. So just knowing exactly what your rights are. I have a resource that I can send to you after this that is really good with telling people what your individual rights are in each state. It's one resource. I'll get that to you. You can put that up wherever you normally would, and people can click on that and kind of explore what it is in their own state that they should know, and maybe speak to law enforcement about. Another thing that I think can be helpful and may even be a good thing to just do in general. Law enforcement officers do like ride-alongs. And if there are law enforcement officers that maybe you know or feel comfortable with, or you have a way that you can request that through your local law enforcement, getting to know who those people are in your community that are working there can go a long way in helping you as an individual understand what you should do in those situations. Seeing other people in those situations and seeing how it's handled, and getting to know maybe that one law enforcement officer that you're riding with can give you so much insight into the best ways to deal with a situation if you ever find yourself in it. I'm trying to think what other things could be very helpful. And nothing else comes to mind right off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think that we're all still learning and growing. So I appreciate the resource, and I am going to share that. So those of you guys who are my Facebook friends or who have subscribed to my YouTube channel, I'll go ahead and put that either in the comments of this video or I'll make it a post on my Facebook page, because I really do want people to feel more empowered, because a lot of the rhetoric that I've been hearing, unfortunately, in different places, not just in the media, has really been violence and, you know, reciprocating violence for violence. And I get that in an effort to save your life, anything would do to, you know, for some people. But the reality is that's not a recommended course. And I'm not saying that most people would do that regardless. I think most people just want to make it home. But I do think that having the conversation about what are some safe, I think we just kind of went out for a second. Really talking about what some safe actions are to take, I think would kind of help de-escalate, you know, the panic and the anxiety and the fear that some people experience as soon as they see those lights go on. So with that being said, should a person become detained by the police, to ensure that your rights are protected, what steps should you take? Because once they actually take you in, even if they take you in for a reason that's really not lawful in the end, what should a person do in that moment to kind of help protect their rights?
Ask for an attorney. Don't make any statements. Don't say anything. Don't do anything. Just ask for an attorney. You have the right to have an attorney be present before you are questioned. So I think it's important for people, especially when you feel like you've been wrongfully detained or arrested, even, to not make any statements. And as soon as you can request an attorney, do that. Because they are there. That's why they're there. They know what the laws are. They know what the situation was, and they can accurately advise their client on that, and kind of go from there.
Absolutely. And so are there, I know that I'm a personal fan of the different shows that come on TV, like, you know, that discuss police officers, you know, in their day-to-day life. But are there any loopholes that the public may not be aware of that officers may use to keep a person detained?
I think just going off of someone not knowing their rights. If you don't know that being detained is not just the police talking to you, for example, they have to have a reason to be talking to you. They have to suspect that something's going on, or it's what we call a consensual encounter, which means that you don't have to stay there. You don't have to continue talking. You're free to go. And it may not feel that way, and it may certainly not look that way. But just knowing that you do have the right to know why you're being detained, and that they should not be detaining you without that reason, that goes a long way into showing a law enforcement officer, oh, they know what they're talking about. What they don't know what else you may know or may not know. So it can be a situation where it's the most helpful to just ask the question of why you're being detained, or to stop talking and just let things take its course, to finally see, when you finally get in front of someone who knows and can see the interaction for what it was.
Okay. I don't know. I don't know what happened. But
No worries.
okay, let's go forward. I think the question that we were answering, if you could remember where you were. I know we stopped kind of mid beat there. Are there loopholes that the public may not be aware of that officers may use to keep a person detained?
I am not aware of any loopholes that there should be to keep someone detained when it's lawful. When it's unlawful, it's already unlawful. There's nothing that they could use to say that it was. You either have the reasonable suspicion that is necessary to stop and detain someone, or you don't have that. I think there can be gray areas on what that is, but that's not something that is going to be known or seen to a law enforcement officer on the side of the road. So in terms of loopholes, I'm not exactly sure in what situation there would be one.
Yeah. And I do question sometimes if even though we talked about before how Paw Patrol and Cops and some of the shows that may have been our only real way to kind of look at the day-to-day life of a police officer, as a non-police officer. And so I was wondering too, when you look at those shows, how easy it could be to assume that they're taking these things from real life, and that police officers will stop at nothing to catch the perp, right? I don't even, think that anybody uses that terminology, but in your mind, you can kind of create a whole scenario, maybe that at the end of the day, they have their training. The law is pretty vast and pretty wide, and I would imagine that if I had to do that same job, that I might not remember every single thing that I was taught. So I don't know how often the refreshers are as to what legal rights people have, but I do think that when it comes right down to it, a lot of what we've been seeing on TV with the killings of unarmed Black and brown people has obviously shown probably less restraint than what we would ever, that could ever really be excused. I don't really think there's like a nicer way to say it. So I do think on one hand, it's easy to probably pull someone over, maybe write a ticket or something like that, and it turned out to be a bogus reason for a ticket. And then it's another thing to just kind of discharge your weapon just because you feel threatened without really considering the other person that's unarmed. So what resources do you recommend to help us educate ourselves on what our legal rights are when dealing with the police? I know you mentioned that you would give me some, but are there any that you can just kind of rattle off that people can go to?
So there is a street law program. Let me see. I'm going to Google really quick. Okay, I'm going to share this in the comments, or share it to you in the comments. Okay, this is called street law. And what street law does is it teaches schools, government agencies, anyone the law in their area. It keeps track of landmark cases. It has a resource library and textbooks all about teaching people what your rights are, when you need to use certain maybe tactics or different things to stay safe and to keep the interaction legal, if that makes sense. The law school that I went to in Nashville has a street law program, and it goes into communities, poor communities, communities of color around Nashville, and puts on these classes. And it gets kids in the communities, adults in the communities together and teaches them what law enforcement is doing, what they're supposed to be doing, and what you can do to minimize those interactions. And if you find yourself in the interaction, exactly what and how you should be, you should conduct yourself, how the law enforcement officers are trained to be conducting themselves, and it kind of gives you a basis of how you would approach that interaction. They are very good at what they do, far better than I am at explaining all of those things. So it's easy to get involved with them. They have a lot of events that go on, and that's one of a major resources I would say is very beneficial and very helpful.
Yeah, so I went ahead and put that on the screen so everybody can see it. It's www.streetlaw.org, and so that's a really awesome resource that you can use to kind of help you stay safe in the interaction and go home once it's all over with. What a person take to prepare to launch a legal protest? I bring this up because ultimately that is the means to the ultimate overarching goal, that we get justice and that there is judicial equality, legislative equality. But I really don't necessarily think that the laws are written against us. I do think that it's a lot of subjective application of when we should be punitive and when we shouldn't, which is unfortunate. But that's why we're holding police officers at such a high standard, because when it comes right down to it, all of us take whatever we've been taught, whatever we thought and we believe, into the workplace with us. And that's just not something that we can afford for police officers to do if they're from their environment with people that don't look like them. So what legal resources do you recommend for those who desire to?
I'm sorry. I think that a big part of that comes down to prosecutors as well. So anytime a law enforcement officer makes an arrest, the one responsible for the charges is the prosecutor, and the prosecutor represents the state in that action. So I think a major avenue, I suppose, that we can really kind of police and look at those issues is through the prosecutor. We are responsible for evaluating the arrest. We evaluate the charges. We decide whether more charges are appropriate or whether less charges are appropriate or no charges are appropriate. And so I think that prosecutors who understand the issues, prosecutors who are able to evaluate those interactions and those arrests are critical to changing the system. We have a lot of discretion, and I think that in any system at some point you have to have someone who makes the decisions. And I think it's imperative to changing things to make sure that the people that you're putting in these positions of power and that make decision-making positions is to make sure that they are the type of people that you would want to make those decisions. You wouldn't want someone with the same biases and the same kind of racist mentality to be making the decisions on that. And you would want someone who can see things for what they are, who is able to make those difficult decisions, to be in those positions. And lucky, or maybe not lucky, I don't know these days, the district attorney positions in Tennessee are elected. So they're designed to reflect what the community wants. And we could go into a whole other spiel about voting rights and all of that kind of thing. But voting is a major way that you can have your voice heard on the community, what the community thinks is the best choice. And so for people who think that maybe voting doesn't make a difference, that's a big way that you can say, these are my values and this is important to me, so I'm working to get this person elected. And that's across the board for city commissioner positions, for mayors, for governors, things like that. And once you do that, I think that you start to see the change, though not quickly enough, through those people that you're putting into those positions.
Yeah, that, and you know what? That is an excellent point, that you don't have to, for those who are looking for a way to kind of help and have their voice be heard, that not every single time do you have to pick up a poster and march in the streets, you know? Some protests can take, take place at the voting polls. So for those who do want to get in the streets, and want to protest, I definitely want you to speak to that. But I do have a question. If you did want to go out in the streets and protest, is there some kind of, because I know that you live in Tennessee and I live in Texas, and each state might have different regulations on what's acceptable and what's not. Because I would imagine that since there are ordinances that control the amount of noise that is, you know, in the streets and things like that, where does a person start legally to even make sure that they have whatever documentation or what have you that they need to physically have a protest where a bunch of people are in the streets?
So your local city offices will have a policy for protesting. If you think about it, kind of like the farmers market has to get permits to have the farmers market down on Saturdays. It's the same thing for protesting. You have to contact the city. You have to give them typically a date, a time, what the event is, and they approve or deny those permits based on like constitutional basis. So if they can't say, no, you can't have the protest, but they could tell you, no, you can't have the protest until 5 p.m. when everyone's off the square or something like that. So if you go to your local government website, whatever that might be, for your county or your city, they will have instructions for how you can request that permit. They'll generally give you time frames of how long you can expect the permit will take to get approved, and what they need from you in order to get that approved. There also are like major organizations, like Black Lives Matter has smaller subsets of organizations that plan those protests as well. So you can also see what you can do about kind of maybe tacking on to a protest that's already happening, where you don't have to worry about any of those legal documents or getting approved or things like that, and you can just attend. But if you do want to kind of create your own, a great place to start is with the city's permit office.
That's excellent information, and I'm hoping that those that are watching that are considering, you know, a protest in their area, or that are considering different ways that they can kind of help to, put a big dent in the numbers of unarmed Black and people of color from being killed in their interactions with the police officers. So, what legal rights does a protester have? I know that we've all seen the news and we've seen how protesters have been tear gassed and water hosed and dogs sicked on them. And it's just been a lot going on out there. So, what legal rights does a protester have?
So I think what's really important to define is what is protesting legally and what is rioting, because those are two different things, and the rights that you have attached are different based on whether you are protesting, which is legal, and rioting versus which is not legal. So a protest, as we all know, is just it's a declaration of what your personal view is, whether you approve of something or you do not approve of something. Typically we see it it's a disapproving way. You don't agree with the way things are going, people are acting, etc. So you get together with a bunch of your friends or a group that's protesting. You are maybe walking through the streets or collecting in an area with signs and just making it known that this is what your position is. Rioting, on the other hand, it starts as kind of what we think of as protesting, but it takes it a step further. It's taking an action to say, we all agree on this, but using the threat of violence or disorder or terrorizing the public, and just totally disrupting the peace of a city. So when you're talking about protesting, you have all of the rights that you are afforded under the First Amendment. So you have the right to have your position. You have the right to say what you want to say. You have the right to hold signs. You have the right to gather. You have the right to essentially just make it well known that this is your position. Rioting, on the other hand, you do not have a legal right to riot. You can't legally terrorize a city or cause destruction and say that you're doing that legally. That's where people kind of end up getting in trouble.
So essentially, protesting is in peacefully. Well, I mean, I don't know that I've ever seen a protest, even a peaceful one, that didn't involve some amount of yelling, some kind of a slogan, no justice, no peace, that kind of thing.
And that's permissible.
That's not rioting. So where do we cross into the line of rioting legally?
Legally, whenever you are using fear, destruction, or you're encouraging that behavior, that's when you cross over from a peaceful protest to rioting. So it's breaking things, it's harming people, destroying buildings, destroying vehicles, that sort of thing. It's anything that could be that's intended to be violent or to cause violence or fear and terror, basically.
So I know that I've seen, where protesters have complained. I think that we've seen this evidenced on the news too, where the protesting will start off very peaceful and then it will be escalated by police violence against the protesters. So in those types of scenarios, which kind of leads me to my next question, well, what legal rights or legal resources would you recommend for those who desire to protest? Does a person need a lawyer? Should they retain someone to kind of be on site? Is there, should there be those there to just, um, maintain some footage so that way every step of the process of the protest can be videotaped, so that way a lawsuit can be filed in the event that the police come in with, gas and different things to antagonize the protesters? Uh-oh. Ashley, you're frozen.
Okay, I think I cut out.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Yeah. So I'll repeat my question. So in situations where and I think that we've seen this evidenced on the news, where the protesters, they come in and they're peaceful, but the police actually bring in um, attack dogs and water hoses and or dogs and gas, and there's a lot of antagonism coming from the police. While I'm not saying that that's always the case, but a lot of my understanding of how peaceful protests become riots are usually in those scenarios. So are you which leads me to my next question. What legal resources do you recommend for those who desire to protest? Should they retain a lawyer? Should the lawyer be on site? Should they have a videography team to make sure that they document every process of the protest, to make sure that they can bring up a lawsuit if they need it?
I think those things can actually be very helpful. There's nothing specifically that I can think of in a legal sense that you would need to do to preemptively kind of guard against those actions by police. Whenever I'm trying to think of a situation really where it would be helpful to what would be helpful to kind of diffuse that situation. And I don't know that there's necessarily something that you could do. I think it's always a good thing to have an attorney whenever situations where it can very quickly turn into a legal issue. I think recording those types of things, that's a great thing to do. It shows exactly what was happening, when it was happening, and you can pinpoint a little better where things went wrong. But I don't know, just educating yourself on what your rights are and what the law is probably the most helpful thing that you can do before organizing a protest in general.
Oh, okay, I think we're back.
Okay. I think my internet just started getting crazy. Sorry about that.
Are you there? Okay. So really quickly,
Okay,
before oh gosh, um, in a situation where there are um, curfews put in place.
mm-hmm.
Still, okay. give a few minutes for Ash in here. I'm not really sure what's going on with the internet connection. And it has been going in and out this entire time. So my apologies to those who are watching. But I do want to thank you so much for tuning. Um, and so it looks like, unfortunately, Ashley's internet just went out. So okay. Um, it looks like two people are watching. Can you make a comment and let me know if you're able to hear me okay? We are having a little bit of issues with the internet here. Um, please make a comment if you can hear me. Okay, here we go. All right, we got Ashley back.
Okay.
Woo! Okay, that's better.
I have no idea what my internet is doing.
Oh.
I don't know if it'll. We'll try this one more time.
Yeah. Is this your phone?
No, it's my computer. It's on Wi-Fi though, so that's probably why it's acting crazy.
Yeah, same. But one of the things I was saying was that if in a particular situation, I think it was in Virginia Beach, the curfew, like literally, I don't know if it was right at the time of curfew, like right on the dot, or like a couple minutes before, or something like that. But the police officers all pulled up and waited until the time of the curfew, and then just started randomly trying to detain people. And so in moments like that, where it's just kind of an ambush almost, what would you recommend?
So if a city has put a curfew in place, my follow it. Especially in times like we're in right now. If you have people looking to law enforcement, looking to make an example of someone or to prove a point, after the curfew, you can be detained and you can be arrested for being out past that curfew. So I think the best way to protect yourself in those situations is to follow the curfew. Have the protests and engage in the protests for the times that the city has said we're protesting. I think that whenever you start getting outside of the curfew times and things like that, you are opening yourself up to be victimized, basically. And I think so there's constitutional laws on what kind of curfews can be put in place, what limitations can be put on protests. And so if there's an issue with the time that the city allowed for the protest, like it's only in 6:30 in the morning to 7:30 in the morning, like things like that have to be addressed through a lawsuit against that agency, basically. So I think in terms of just protecting yourself and avoiding additional charges or anything like that, just follow the basic curfews and the rules put in place for those protests.
That absolutely makes sense. I mean, it's unfortunate that we're in this position, but certainly making sure that you're above reproach is kind of maybe one of the better tools that we have in making sure that if we are unlawfully detained or unlawfully arrested, that we're able to prove that in a court of law. And, at that point, then we might be able to, is it possible to sue? I mean, I want to make sure that we get that on record too. Is it something that can be done? I know that courts are backed up. COVID-19, a lot's going on.
Yeah, there is a lot going on. It is possible to sue. There are lots of rules and lots of laws and everything like that when it comes to suing a government agency. So there's a lot of red tape there, but it is possible and you can do it. The way that you do it will depend on what your state allows and what kind of mechanisms you're supposed to use in your state. So it would be another situation where you need to look and see what your state's rules are and their laws, how you file lawsuits and go about that there.
Okay. And I'm gonna go ahead and get to our last question. So how do you think that the proposal that many people have made to have the police defunded, how do you think that would work if it's carried out? And I guess you can speak from a nationwide perspective and from a statewide perspective.
Yes, so this is my favorite question. I've been waiting the whole time to answer this one. I think movements like this are not necessarily new, but we're viewing them in a totally different light than we have before. So I think that it's important to understand there's a big difference in defunding the police and abolishing the police. And I think that that's kind of gotten mixed up a lot in the arguments that people are making for and against each one. But specifically looking at defunding the police, I don't know. I think it's a good idea to take funding and fund communities where we have kind of substituted police for mental health crisis situations, for family dispute situations. We've over criminalized is essentially what I'm saying. So using the defund the police movement to redirect funding, I think, is an important thing to talk about. There will always be situations where you need police, where they have to be involved. You've got crimes like murder and things like that you really need to have investigated, that you need to have looked into and people prosecuted in those situations. However, when going back to our example from before, you have someone in the community who's maybe knocking stuff over and yelling at a fence, and what law enforcement finds when they first get there is she's off her medication. She's schizophrenic and hasn't been taking her medication, and now this is what we're seeing. That is not solved or resolved by making an arrest and taking her through the justice system. That issue is addressed by having a crisis counselor or a social worker. So in terms of defunding the police to redirect funding and give opportunities to communities to stay out of the criminal justice system, I think is imperative to changing the entire system. But by that being said, taking it a step further to abolish police, I think, is not in the best interest of communities. Police serve the purpose of, or what they're supposed to do is serve the purpose of being peace officers and acting in the best interest of communities to keep everyone in that community safe. And we've kind of taken that role and we've not used it the way that it's supposed to be used. And in doing that, we've criminalized things like mental health and drug use and things like that.
And these are really good points. I think a lot of people, especially when talking about race relations and how everyday Black actions are criminalized or looked at as, the possible start of something criminal, right? Going to Starbucks, jogging in a neighborhood, just random things that should be normal everyday citizen behavior. And I really do believe that a lot of that, as you alluded to, is overworking of the police. These people get trained to execute the law, and they're the like authority behind the law. Put people in jail that are intentionally breaking the law, and even those that are not intentionally doing it. Handing out tickets, citations, that kind of thing. But they're not necessarily supposed to be everybody. They're not supposed to be per se crisis counselors and different things like that. I do think that perhaps taking a different direction on what our police are responsible for would absolutely help in clarifying some of these issues. Because if you send someone out who just saw somebody killed right in front of their own eyes, maybe their partner was killed, or different things are taking place, and they are still on duty cops, and then you put them in volatile situations, I think that it makes for every interaction after some kind of traumatic experiences has taken place, and that cop has been a part of. I think it might be a lot more easy to have escalated situations for no good reason. And so I do think that really making sure that there's some kind of liaison to make sure that the police aren't getting dispatched for things that are really small and that don't necessarily require a Yep. Okay. So it's a good thing that we're almost done.
Yes.
I- but
Mm.
We could be getting affected by that outage.
well, guys, I don't know what's been going on with the internet lately. I don't know. All I can say is that I hope that something said in this podcast was of special benefit, and hopefully, I'll be able to get another go with Ashley, maybe using a different platform. A different platform. Can't even talk. And so, unfortunately, we weren't actually able to say bye to Ashley and thank her for coming out. But definitely hit the replay on this, like, share, subscribe. My YouTube name is The Couch. Rest of your day, and we're going to go on ahead and get out of here. Bye.